Hello, you are on the History Voice channel. Today you will hear the story of a soldier who returned from the army with no money but with a burning desire to gain everything. Now, let's move on to the story. The airport was crowded, yet for Daniel Kane, it felt eerily quiet. His boots hit the tiled floor with a weight that echoed more in his mind than in reality. He was back. No desert heat, no gunfire, no sand-filled nights of whispered orders and burning skies. Just the cold hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of fried food wafting from a nearby kiosk. Daniel carried a single duffel bag. Inside were reminders of another life, a knife with initials carved into the handle, a faded photograph of his squad, and a military patch torn from his uniform after his last mission. His bank account was nearly empty, his future uncertain. Walking through the crowd, no one noticed him. To them he was just another man in his late 30s, a little scarred, broad-shouldered, his jaw set like granite. But inside, Daniel carried the weight of 100 battles. The civilian struggle. His hometown hadn't changed much. The same diner with peeling paint, the same gas station where teenagers gathered at night, the same cracked sidewalks. But Daniel had changed. His first week home, he tried to find work. Construction companies turned him down. A warehouse hired him for a few days, then let him go after he frightened a manager with his intensity. He was too disciplined, too direct. Civilians didn't understand. At night, he would sit in his small rented apartment, staring at the ceiling. Flashbacks hit like landmines, the sound of an explosion, the sight of a comrade falling, the smell of smoke. He poured whiskey into a chipped glass, telling himself he needed sleep, not memories. Bills piled up. His savings from the military were gone in weeks. He was broke, but not broken. A chance encounter. One evening, Daniel was walking home when he noticed a group of young men cornering a local shop owner outside a convenience store. They were loud, aggressive, trying to intimidate the old man for money. Daniel stepped forward without hesitation. His voice cut through the noise. "Back off." The men laughed, mocking him, until he moved. Years of training unleashed in seconds. He disarmed one, pinned another against the wall, and sent the rest running with nothing more than sheer presence. The old shop owner, trembling but safe, looked at Daniel with gratitude. "You're not a cop, are you?" the old man asked. "No," Daniel replied, adjusting his jacket. "You should be," the man said. "Or something like it." Those words stuck with him. The idea. The next morning, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a notebook. He scribbled words: protection, security, brotherhood. He thought of the men he had served with, disciplined, skilled, but lost in civilian life just like him. What if they could build something together? He visited a local bank, tried to explain his vision, a private security company. The loan officer shook his head. No collateral, no experience in business. Daniel left frustrated, but not defeated. Instead, he called an old friend, Marcus Doyle, a fellow veteran now working in private contracting overseas. Marcus laughed at first, but when he heard the determination in Daniel's voice, he grew serious. "You've always been the stubborn one," Marcus said. "All right. I'll back you. Not with money, but with contacts. I know people who need protection, real protection, not mall cops with flashlights." That was the spark. Building the team. Daniel started with what little he had. He rented a small office above a garage, painted the walls himself, and set up a second-hand desk with a single laptop. On the door, he placed a sign: Kane Security Solutions. At first, the jobs were small. Guarding a construction site from vandals. Escorting a businessman carrying sensitive documents. But word spread. Unlike others, Daniel and his men were professionals. They didn't just stand around, they planned routes, studied threats, and operated like a military unit. Slowly, he recruited others. Alex "Hawk" Hawthorne, a sniper with a calm demeanor and a sharp mind. Reyes "Ghost" Ramirez, a demolitions expert turned family man, needing steady income. Clark, a medic who had saved Daniel's life once in Afghanistan. They weren't just employees. They were brothers again. The first big contract. Months later, Kane Security received their first major call. A local politician had received threats. His family was in danger. The police offered protection, but the politician wanted something more discreet, more effective. Daniel met him in a private office. The man looked nervous, sipping water as he explained the situation. "You'll be paid well," the politician said, "but more importantly, my wife and kids, they can't know fear." "Can you do that?" Daniel nodded. "That's what we do." For 3 weeks, Kane Security shadowed the family, coordinated safe routes, monitored communications. When an attempted kidnapping occurred outside a school, Daniel's team intercepted the attackers, neutralizing them with precision. The news didn't report it. It was handled quietly, but those in power took notice. Kane Security was no longer a small-town operation. A man transformed. As contracts grew, so did Daniel's sense of purpose. He wore suits now instead of camouflage, but the soldier never left him. He ran the company with military discipline, punctuality, loyalty, and honor. Yet, when he looked in the mirror, he still saw the scars. The nightmares hadn't stopped. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, he'd grip the edge of his bed, sweating, hearing voices from the battlefield. One evening, Marcus called from overseas. "You're making waves, brother," Marcus said. "I hear Kane Security is on the rise. But listen, success paints a target on your back. Be ready." Daniel brushed it off, but deep down, he knew. The past doesn't disappear. It waits. And somewhere, across the ocean, men who once faced Daniel Kane in combat were watching his rise. Men with grudges. Men with blood debts to settle. The storm was coming. The office above the garage was long gone. Kane Security Solutions had moved into a glass-walled building downtown, its logo displayed proudly on the side. Inside, rows of desks buzzed with activity. Analysts scanning intelligence feeds, operators preparing for missions, phones ringing with new contracts. Daniel Kane stood in his corner office, overlooking the city skyline. He wore a tailored suit now, his tie perfectly knotted, but his stance still carried the rigid discipline of a soldier. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building an empire. Expansion. It started with domestic contracts, politicians, wealthy businessmen, high-profile events. But soon, word of Kane Security's efficiency spread across borders. Marcus Doyle, still working contacts overseas, funneled opportunities to Daniel. Corporations needed secure transport in unstable regions. Journalists needed protection in war zones. Even governments hired them for discreet operations. Daniel traveled constantly, his passport filling with stamps: Lagos, Istanbul, Caracas, Kiev. His men thrived under his leadership. Alex Hawk coordinated sniper overwatch for convoys in South America. Reyes Ghost handled logistics and explosives detection in volatile areas. Clark ensured their medical response was unmatched. Kane Security became synonymous with professionalism. They weren't mercenaries, at least, not in Daniel's eyes. They were protectors. Where law enforcement ended, they began. But success came at a price. The distance. At home, Daniel felt like a stranger. His mother had passed away while he was overseas. He attended the funeral in silence, wearing dark sunglasses, then returned to work the next day. Relationships crumbled before they began. Women were drawn to his strength, but few could endure his absences, his walls of steel, the secrets he carried. His apartment had been replaced by a penthouse, but it was as empty as the first room he'd rented after coming home. Sometimes he'd stand on the balcony at night, drink in hand, staring at the city lights, not out of joy, but out of restlessness. Marcus noticed the change when they met in Dubai for a contract. "You built all this," Marcus said, gesturing at the luxury around them. "But when's the last time you actually lived, Dan?" Daniel didn't answer. The threat emerges. The first sign came quietly. During a contract in Eastern Europe, one of Kane's convoys was ambushed. Not by bandits, not by rebels, but by men using military tactics. Professional. Precise. Daniel reviewed the after-action report. His jaw tightened as he read the description of the attackers' insignia, a faded red scorpion stitched on their jackets. He knew that symbol. Years ago, in the Middle East, he had crossed paths with a militia known as the Red Scorpions. Ruthless, brutal, and led by a warlord named Viktor Malenkov. Daniel's team had dismantled one of their strongholds, leaving Viktor's brother dead. It seemed the Scorpions hadn't forgotten. Warning signs. Back at headquarters, Daniel convened his top men. The conference room was filled with maps, photos, and files. "This wasn't random," Daniel said, pointing at the ambush report. "They knew our route. They knew our timing. Which means one of two things: they've got eyes everywhere, or we've got a leak." Silence hung in the room. Hawk leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You think they're targeting you?" "They're targeting the company," Daniel replied. "And that means they're targeting me." Ghost slammed his fist on the table. "Then we hit back. Hard." Daniel shook his head. "Not yet. This isn't about vengeance. It's about survival. We'll adapt. Change protocols. Every mission from now on assumes compromise." But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The corporate front. Even as shadows gathered, Kane Security's influence grew. They signed contracts with multinational corporations, guarding oil fields in Africa and tech executives in Asia. Daniel was invited to conferences, panels, even television interviews. He was called a visionary, a man who had turned battlefield scars into a global enterprise. But in those interviews, when the cameras flashed and journalists asked about his success, Daniel always felt like a fraud. He wasn't a visionary. He was a soldier who never stopped fighting. He had just changed the battlefield. At night, the past returned in dreams: the firefight in the desert, Victor's brother falling, the look in his eyes before the bullet struck. Daniel would wake drenched in sweat, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. A personal attack. The war finally reached his doorstep. One evening, Clark was leaving headquarters when his car exploded in a fireball. The shockwave shattered windows, flames lighting up the street. Clark survived, barely, but the message was clear. The Scorpions were no longer hiding in foreign war zones. They were here. Daniel visited Clark in the hospital. His friend's face was burned, his voice hoarse. They knew my schedule," Clark whispered. "Somebody's feeding them intel." Daniel's fists clenched. He felt the old rage stirring, the same cold fury that had carried him through firefights. "This ends now," he said. Crossing the line. The board of directors, businessmen who had invested in Kane Security, urged caution. "If you escalate, you'll scare away clients," one of them warned. "Handle this quietly. Don't let your emotions—" Daniel silenced him with a glare. "My men are being hunted. This isn't about business. This is war." Ignoring their protests, Daniel flew to Europe with Hawk and Ghost. They tracked leads, interrogated arms dealers, bribed informants. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. The Scorpions had rebuilt themselves into a transnational syndicate, smuggling weapons, trafficking, running private armies. And Viktor Malenkov was at the center. One night, Daniel sat in a dimly lit hotel room, staring at a photo of Viktor. The man was older now, but his eyes were the same, cold, ruthless. Marcus called him on a secure line. "Dan, listen to me. If you go after Malenkov, you'll be declaring open war. You'll drag Kane Security into a conflict it might not survive." Daniel's voice was low, steady. He already declared war when he put Clark in that hospital. The rise before the fall. By the end of that year, Kane Security was operating in over a dozen countries. They had contracts worth millions, fleets of armored vehicles, a small army of trained men. Daniel Kane's name was whispered in the same breath as legends of the private military world. But power came with enemies. Governments began scrutinizing him. Rivals plotted against him. And somewhere, Viktor Malenkov was preparing his next move. Daniel stood once more in his glass office, the city stretching out beneath him. To the world, he was a success story, the soldier who became a titan. But he knew the truth. The higher he climbed, the further there was to fall. And the fall was coming. The rain hammered against the windows of Kane Security's headquarters as Daniel sat in the war room. Maps covered the walls, screens flickered with live feeds, and the air buzzed with urgency. Clark, still recovering, joined by video call. His face was scarred, but his eyes were steady. Hawk leaned against the wall, arms crossed, while Ghost paced like a caged animal. Daniel pointed to the board. Red pins marked recent incidents, ambushes, assassinations, bombings. All tied to the Scorpions. They're not just after us, Daniel said. They're destabilizing entire regions. Governments, corporations, civilians. Anyone in their path. Ghost slammed the table. So what are we waiting for? Let's take them apart piece by piece. Hawk's calm voice cut through. That's what they want. They'll draw us into the open. Bleed us until we can't fight back. Daniel exhaled slowly. We don't have the luxury of waiting. If we don't move first, they'll destroy everything we've built. The betrayal. The next blow came not from the battlefield but from within. During a high-profile contract protecting a shipping magnate in Singapore, Kane's security was compromised. Pirates intercepted the vessel, but they knew exact details of the route and escort schedule, information only a handful of Kane's senior staff possessed. Back at headquarters, Daniel's suspicions grew. There was a traitor in their ranks. He called a closed meeting with Hawk and Ghost. Somebody's feeding them intel, Daniel said, his voice low. Clark's ambush wasn't chance. The Singapore hit wasn't chance. We've got a mole. Ghost growled. Who? We've bled with these men. Somebody changed, Daniel replied. Money, fear, maybe both. But we find him, or Malenkov will tear us apart from the inside. The hunt for the traitor began quietly, with background checks, surveillance, and interrogation. Weeks passed before Hawk discovered encrypted communications hidden in the company servers. The trail led to a mid-level manager, a man Daniel himself had recruited years ago, Jacob Vance. When confronted, Vance didn't deny it. Shackled to a chair in the interrogation room, his lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think you're different, Kane," he hissed. "You build your empire on blood. Same as Malenkov. At least he doesn't hide it behind a suit and a logo." Daniel's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain composed. "You sold out your brothers." "I survived," Vance spat. "And you won't." They handed him over to authorities, but the damage was done. Escalation. Within weeks, Kane's security faced coordinated strikes. An armored convoy in Africa was annihilated. An office in Berlin was bombed. Stocks of their parent corporation plummeted as investors fled. Journalists began to circle, painting Daniel as a warmonger who had provoked old enemies. Politicians distanced themselves. What had once been celebrated as a story of resilience was now under fire. In his penthouse, Daniel stood alone, watching the chaos on the news. He poured himself a drink, but his hands trembled. The walls he had built around himself were cracking. Marcus called. "Dan, you've got to pull back. Scale down. Survive." "No," Daniel said firmly. "If we retreat, they win. And I'm done running." A ghost from the past. Then came the message. Delivered in a black envelope, slipped under Daniel's office door. Inside was a single photo, Viktor Malenkov, standing in front of a burning vehicle, his eyes staring straight into the camera. Beneath it, handwritten words. "Debt must be paid." Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from recognition. Malenkov wasn't taunting him. He was declaring the final stage of the war. The kidnapping. The attack that changed everything came when Kane's security least expected it. Reyes, Ghost, Ramirez's family was targeted. His wife and young daughter were kidnapped outside their home. The Scorpions sent a video. Masked men dragging the family into a van, Malenkov's voice echoing over the footage. "You took my blood. Now I take yours. Come to me, Kane. Alone." Ghost was inconsolable, raging, ready to burn the world down. Hawk tried to calm him, but nothing worked. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get them back," Daniel said. "No," Ghost snarled, eyes wild. "I'll get them back." Daniel shook his head. "Not alone. He wants me, but he doesn't understand. He's not fighting one man. He's fighting all of us." The plan. Daniel devised a counterstrike. Using intelligence from Marcus's contacts, they tracked the Scorpions' operations to an abandoned factory complex on the outskirts of Bucharest. It was heavily guarded, bristling with weapons, practically a fortress. But Daniel had fought in worse places. The plan was simple and brutal. infiltrate, extract Ghost's family, and cripple the Scorpion's base. Hawk would provide overwatch, Clark would coordinate medical evac, Ghost would breach with Daniel. Before the mission, Daniel gathered the team. "I won't lie to you," he said. "This won't end tonight. Malenkov won't stop until one of us is dead. But we protect our own. That's why we're here. That's why we exist. Brotherhood doesn't die." Ghost's eyes burned with gratitude and rage. Hawk gave a single nod. Clark whispered, "Then let's bring them home." The assault. The night was black with rain as the team approached the compound. Hawk's suppressed rifle cracked in the distance, eliminating sentries one by one. Ghost planted charges at the outer gates. When the breach came, it was chaos. Explosions lit the night, gunfire roared. Daniel moved like a predator, clearing rooms with ruthless precision. Ghost fought like a man possessed, cutting through enemies with fury. They found the hostages in a basement, tied and bruised but alive. Ghost fell to his knees, embracing his daughter with trembling hands. But as they prepared to exfiltrate, a voice echoed through the loudspeakers. "Kane!" Daniel froze. He knew that voice. "Victor Malenkov. You saved them tonight. But this is only the beginning. You took my brother. Now I will take your empire. Piece by piece. Until you beg me for death." The loudspeakers cut, replaced by the sound of retreating vehicles. Malenkov had been there, and escaped again. Aftermath. Back at base, the victory felt hollow. Ghost's family was safe, but Kane's security was bleeding resources, allies, and reputation. Daniel stared at the map in silence, the weight of command heavier than ever. Hawk finally broke the silence. "He's not going to stop, Dan. You know that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Neither am I." For the first time, his voice carried not just determination, but something darker. It wasn't just about defense anymore. It was about vengeance. And the final reckoning with Malenkov was inevitable. The winter air in Bucharest bit through Daniel's coat as he stepped out of the black SUV. Snow fell in slow spirals, muffling the city's chaos. He pulled his scarf tighter, his eyes scanning every rooftop, every shadow. Kane's security was a shell of what it had been. Contracts cancelled, offices closed, governments distancing themselves. The media painted Daniel as a warlord in a suit. Investors abandoned him. But none of it mattered now. What mattered was Victor Malenkov. Daniel had tracked him through smuggling routes, black market whispers, and blood-soaked alleys. Now the trail ended here, in an abandoned Soviet-era airbase outside the city. Inside that fortress, Malenkov waited. The last briefing. The team gathered in the safe house the night before. Hawk checked his rifle, calm as ever. Ghost loaded magazines with shaking hands, rage still burning in his chest. Clark patched wounds and laid out morphine, his silence heavier than words. Daniel stood before them, map spread on the table. "This is it," he said. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned. "Malenkov's there. Intel says he's gathered his lieutenants, planning to expand their operations. If we take him down, the Scorpions fracture. If we fail..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Ghost slammed a magazine into his rifle. "Then we don't fail." Hawk looked at Daniel. "And when it's done..." Daniel paused. He thought of his company, his empire crumbling, the brothers he had already lost. He thought of the nightmares that would never leave him. "When it's done," Daniel said softly, "maybe I finally get to sleep." The infiltration. The night was silent as their convoy approached the airbase. Snow crunched under boots, breath fogged in the cold. Hawk climbed into a sniper's nest on a ruined tower, scope glinting under the moon. Ghost and Clark followed Daniel to the perimeter. The breach was violent. Suppressed shots, knives in the dark, guards collapsing silently into snow. They slipped inside, moving like phantoms through rusted hangars and crumbling corridors. But Malenkov was ready. The alarm shattered the silence. Floodlights blazed, gunfire erupted from every direction. Dozens of Scorpions poured from the shadows, their rifles blazing. "Contact left!" Ghost roared, unleashing fire. Hawk's rifle cracked from the tower, each shot dropping a target. Clark dragged a wounded operator behind cover, his hands slick with blood. Daniel moved through it all like a storm, precise and relentless, cutting a path toward the central command hall. The duel. Inside the hall, flames flickered from barrels. Maps and crates littered the room. And at the far end, Viktor Malenkov stood. He was broader now, his face lined with scars, his eyes cold as stone. In his hands, he held an old AK, but he set it down slowly, deliberately. Daniel Kane, Malenkov's voice rumbled, accented, mocking. The soldier who pretends to be a businessman. The killer dressed as a protector. Daniel leveled his rifle. It ends tonight. Malenkov smirked. Yes. For one of us. The duel erupted like thunder. Gunfire echoed in the cavernous hall, sparks flying as bullets tore through metal. Daniel rolled behind cover, returning fire with surgical precision. Malenkov moved like a predator, his bulk belying his speed. When their rifles emptied, both men drew knives. The clash was primal, steel against steel, grunts of effort, the crunch of fists against bone. Malenkov's strength was brutal, his blade slashing Daniel's arm, his fist cracking ribs. But Daniel fought with something more. He fought with memory, of Clark in the hospital, of Ghost's daughter screaming, of every man he'd buried. He fought not for glory, but for justice. With a roar, Daniel drove his knife deep into Malenkov's chest. The warlord staggered, eyes wide with shock, blood spilling onto the concrete. "You took everything," Malenkov gasped. Daniel leaned close, his voice a whisper of iron. "And you paid the price." He twisted the blade. Malenkov fell. The collapse. Outside, the base was chaos. Explosions shook the ground as Ghost detonated charges on the Scorpion's armory. Hawk's shots kept waves of enemies at bay. Clark dragged the wounded into evac vehicles. Daniel emerged from the hall, bloodied but alive. He gave the signal. "Fall back. Now." They fought their way out, flames consuming the base behind them. As the convoy roared into the night, the airbase collapsed in fire and steel, the Scorpions shattered with their leader dead. The price. Back at the safe house, silence hung heavy. Hawk sat cleaning his rifle, his face unreadable. Ghost clutched his daughter's photo, tears glistening in his eyes. Clark stitched wounds by lamplight, exhaustion etched deep. Daniel sat apart, staring at his bloodied hands. The war was over, but peace eluded him. Marcus called again, his voice crackling over the secure line. "You did it. The Scorpions are finished." "But what now, Dan? Kane security is collapsing. Governments won't touch you after this. Investors are gone. You're a soldier without a war, again." Daniel's eyes lingered on the city lights outside. "Then I build something new," he said quietly. "Not for profit. Not for power. For the people who still need protecting." Marcus was silent for a moment. Then, "You'll never change, brother." "Maybe not," Daniel whispered. Epilogue. Months later, the world had moved on. Kane Security no longer existed as a corporation, but whispers spoke of a smaller, quieter organization operating in the shadows. Protecting journalists in war zones. Guarding aid convoys through hostile territories. Shielding those who couldn't defend themselves. At its center was a scarred man, haunted but unyielding. Daniel Kane walked a different battlefield now, one without logos, contracts, or shareholders. A battlefield where protection was personal, and where the only payment he demanded was loyalty and trust. In his heart, he knew he would never escape the ghosts. But he had found something close to redemption, a purpose that could not be bought. The world called him many things: mercenary, protector, soldier of fortune. But to the few who knew the truth, he was something else. He was the man who refused to stop fighting. Even when the war was over.